Hey, everybody. I'm excited to have you join us this week when I get to talk with Kerri Lewis. Now, Kerri is joining us to talk to us about grief, how grief can sometimes appear in our lives, how we all tend to deal with grief a little bit differently, and most importantly, how we can be a support system to those around us who are experiencing grief. Before we get started with this conversation, I do want to remind you I've got the Cool Grandpa store over on my website. So go over there, check it out. I'm sure there's some polo shirts, some caps, some things over there that might interest you or the cool grandpa in your life. So head on over to cool-grandpa.us and check out that podcast store. Without further ado, let's jump into this awesome conversation with Kerri. Kerri, welcome to the Cool Grandpa podcast. I'm excited to have you on to talk about this important subject of grief. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Greg, and I appreciate you inviting me to be on today. I think this is an extremely important topic and one that I don't think is always addressed. And so I'm very happy to talk with you today and your audience.
Well, I appreciate it. I know grief tends to be one of those things that it's important to talk about, but nobody really wants to have those discussions. So I know we're going to have a good time with it, and we're going to learn a lot, and it's going to help a lot of people.
Good. I certainly hope so.
Now, I want to start out by having you give us a little bit of a background of yourself and tell us a little bit about how you found your way into grief counseling.
Well, as you can see, I'm just a regular person. I'm a widow, a mom, a grandmother, and a dreamer. And I got into this because I lost my own husband 7.5 years ago, very unexpectedly and suddenly. And I was just devastated. My life was completely turned upside down, and I didn't know what to do. I went for probably a year or more just suffering and not just, I kind of walked around like a robot. I was on the earth functioning, but not really. And a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, made the suggestion that I get some counseling. And my first thought about that was, that's not going to help me. They don't know how badly I feel, and nothing's ever going to be the same. But after thinking about that a little bit, I realized that I really wanted to feel better. I was tired of feeling so bad all the time and not being productive and just feeling miserable. So I got my counseling. And through that process, a little spark ignited inside of me. And I just started thinking, I knew how much better I felt as a result of that. And I really wanted to do the same for others. So I enrolled in a certification course, and even when I did that, I wasn't really certain what I was going to do. But by the time I finished that course, which it took about a year, I knew for sure what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to help other people work through their grief. I also wanted people to know that they're not alone. And that's one of the things that does happen. You feel completely alone. Nobody understands you. Nobody knows what to do with you and that sort of thing. So that's exactly how I got into it.
Okay. And I love how you brought up that sense of loneliness up. The few people that I've talked to about this, as well as just experiences with other people, is that when you might have an event happen, you have the people that bring the casseroles, you have the people that make a phone call, but then it's week 2, week 3, week 4, as people just return back to their normal lives. It's nothing that they're doing wrong. It's just, okay, now it's you having to process and deal with what you're feeling.
That's exactly right. Well, first of all, you mentioned the casserole. It made me kind of giggle because in the very early stages after my husband died, I did have neighbors who came through with buckets of Kentucky Fried Chicken and big boxes from, what's that restaurant? Olive Garden, full of lasagna and salad. And I was very appreciative of that because not only did I just had no energy to cook or do anything. So those were very appreciated. But you're right. After a little while, it's natural for people to go back to their lives. It's expected that they're going to do that. And in my case, because my husband did die so suddenly and unexpectedly, I was in a state of shock for quite a long time, really. I just could not get my head around the fact that this man was not ever going to be walking through the door again. So I had, um, a lot of people around, and then I didn't have anybody around. My mother happened to be living with me at the time, and was very elderly, and she was very ill, and she was very old fashioned, and she felt like after a couple of weeks I should just be over it and move on with my life. So she was very angry with me that I wasn't doing that. So I was dealing with all of that. So that felt very lonely. And I just, I didn't know exactly what to do. And so I didn't do anything. That was my response, other than what I absolutely had to do. But the one thing I did do was, I got up every day. I took a shower every day. I may not do my hair and my makeup, but at least I did that. Like I said, I had my mother to care for, which, good or bad, at least it was something to do. Again, over time, I remember one of the things that was really, it struck me at the time, people would come to visit me once in a while, and maybe we'd watch a movie or something, or we'd get talking about my husband, and we'd start laughing, and I would immediately pull back. So I can't do that. I shouldn't be laughing. I shouldn't be happy. He's dead. How could I laugh? So that was, a lot of the feelings. So there was a lot of things going on besides just the grief itself. There's just so much in that. And even getting down to simple things like taking care of financial issues, banks and credit cards and mortgage holders, they're not sympathetic at all.
No.
They could care less about what you're going through. It's like, well, we just need to settle some things. And that was very difficult.
I can imagine. One of the things that jumped out at me when you were talking was, I think, some of the idea of what especially maybe widows are supposed to do. And, my mind jumps back because I'm kind of a historian, and I remember some of the figures from, let's say, the Revolutionary War in the U.S. We can certainly go further back, but widows of generals and officers and people that were almost put up on a pedestal, the way that the women acted and behaved and things. And I don't know, from a guy's perspective, if there's still that kind of an expectation with women on how you're supposed to handle a loss and how you're supposed to do that. And if there's that imbalance between what your reality is versus what you feel like expectations are.
Part of the problem with that is that our society, at least here in the United States, we are not taught or trained how to behave when we have someone die or we lose something that's valuable to us. Maybe it's a divorce or the end of a relationship, whatever it might be. So that's part of the problem. I think an older generation, like my mother's generation, for example, I think their expectations certainly were different than my generation or even my daughter's generation, where we're allowed to at least show our emotions, whereas her generation wasn't. But there's still, people are uncomfortable with grief. So if you want to talk about your husband or your whoever it is that passed, people are uncomfortable with that. They don't know what to say. We all know that, people mean well, but they will come across with platitudes like, well, he's probably better off, or, you'll get things in time, things will heal, you'll feel better, or, things like that. And they're, when you're going through that, it's really irritating when people say things like that, even though you realize that they mean well. That's all they're trying to do is help you. So that's part of what I've incorporated into my practice is helping others. It's not just about the person who's lost somebody, but maybe a family member or somebody, because the one thing that helps probably more than anything when you're going through this is being able to talk to someone who doesn't judge you, who doesn't give you advice, who doesn't make suggestions about how long you should be grieving or any of that. They just simply listen. They let you cry or scream or carry on, whatever you feel like you need to do. The other thing that's very helpful is someone just simply give you a hug. Even if it's just a virtual hug, if they're not close to you, but they send you a little note, say, here's a virtual hug for you. That it just makes all the difference in the world and how you feel.
Mm. No, that's great advice, because I think sometimes, like you said, if you're not the person experiencing it, it can be clumsy without the intent of,
Yes.
I don't know what to do or what to say or what this person needs. So
Right.
I think presence, like you said, presence, and then just hey, I'm thinking about you. Let me know if you want to talk and hang out, whatever that might be.
That's right. And it makes a huge difference. And, I would encourage anyone, even though they don't feel comfortable with it, live with that discomfort. Go ahead and dive in, let the person that's grieving talk to you. And the same thing on the other side. I know one of the things that for me was wonderful is my daughter I could talk to her, and she never advised me. She never judged me. She never did anything like that. She just listened. And every now and then she'd say, we loved Bobby too. My husband's name was Bobby, and we loved him too. And, that's what I needed. That's really all I needed. And that's basically what counseling is all about. People who are grieving, they're not crazy. They don't need therapy necessarily. It can reach those levels, but in most cases, it's simply that they just need to talk about how they're feeling and have someone listen and understand that. And in my case, I use some science-based techniques such as meditation, deep breathing, things like that. And they are very helpful. Journaling, all of those things they sound a little cliche, but they actually do work.
Well, sure. And I think, there's a reason journaling has been around for a couple of thousand years. I think we go back to the Greeks and the Romans, and some of those deep thinkers sit there and they talk about the loss of a friend or the loss of a spouse or children or something. And we've got letters and we have, some of their writings for that. And they sat down to do that, as to, hey, this is what I'm feeling. They might have the approach of like, this is how I should manage it. But it was being able to sit down and write it and talk about it and do those things.
Well, exactly. And I don't think, as far as managing grief, especially in the early phases of it, you don't need to manage it. You just need to just deal with it, as far as, let the feelings come to you, not bottle them up. One of the mistakes a lot of people make, and this is particularly true of men, and especially older men, we'll say 55 and older, they bottle up their emotions. They don't want to show their emotions. They don't want to talk about them. And yet they're grieving just the same as anybody else. And by doing that, they're only prolonging their grief. They don't heal. They don't really get any better. And if they eventually don't find someone to speak with about their issues, then it can turn into depression and other deeper problems.
Oh, sure.
And
I do want to take a step back, though, and learn a little bit about what was your family and friends' reaction to, as you were working through your grief and you're starting to come through that, being able to tell them that, hey, I want to go in and study grief and become a grief counselor.
Well, I'm very fortunate because I have a very supportive daughter and grandsons, and they were very supportive of the idea. My daughter said, "Mom, if that's what you want to do, I'll do whatever I can to support you. I think it's a great idea." And my grandsons felt the same way. And even most of my friends, they said, "That's great." Whether they really thought I would do it or not, I don't know. But they let me know that they were supportive of me in doing this. The only concern they had was, well, if you're dealing with grief, is that going to prolong your own grief? And I was concerned about that as well, to be honest. But the very first client I had after I completed my training was a woman who had lost her adult daughter. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be so hard for me. And it was, and yet when I finished that first session, I felt it was like a high that I couldn't even express. It was amazing because I knew that I had helped her. She told me how much better she felt. And of course, we continued on with our sessions for about 6 weeks, and it helped her get through probably the worst period of her life. And that helped me tremendously as well. It felt good. It felt good to be helping others. I knew that I was doing something that was needed and purposeful, and it brought me a lot of joy.
Oh,
and it still does.
well, and a question I've got for you too is, as you're starting out on this journey, and I don't know how grief counseling and some of these things work, do you have a mentor that you're working with as you start to hang out your shingle and start to take on people that you're working with?
Yes. In fact, this course that I took, the trainer called herself a mentor and invited all of us in the class. I think there were 12 of us in that particular class, and invited us to contact her at any time we needed help. And the course is very complete. There's a manual. It's like, I don't know, 500 pages or something. And it goes over just every aspect of this. And then there's ongoing education as well through that. So I can call her, my trainer, my mentor, anytime. Even now, it's been, I think, almost 5 years now. And I can still call her to this day or text her, just let her know I need help or just run something by her. And that's tremendously helpful to me. And I also have an advantage probably over others in that my son-in-law is a therapist and my daughter is about to be one. So I have a lot of support in that way.
That's awesome. I was curious about that because I'm sure as anybody that's starting out, whether it's counseling or therapist or something like that, at some point you're going to get something that you've never come across before.
Yes.
And it's good to be able to have that mentor or that colleague or somebody that you can go, hey, by the way, here's something I've never seen before.
Right.
What's some of your advice and lessons learned? Maybe they've seen that a couple of times.
Yes, exactly. And the other thing is that when you're going through something like this with a client, there are times when I'll get a client who I can clearly see that my expertise doesn't cover what they need, and I will recommend that they see a therapist themselves. And sometimes they'll do it, sometimes they won't. But, I try to stay out of that realm of being a therapist because I'm not a therapist and I don't want to get into that at all. I just, like I said, I'm here as a counselor and that's it. So.
Okay. Since we brought it up, what's the difference between a counselor and a therapist
Well, a therapist they have far more extensive training than I do. They have a lot more schooling to go through. They're required to get their master's degree, and then they're still training on top of that. They can go get their PhD. I mean, there's a lot of things they can do, whereas I don't have to do that. My role is not to tell people what to do or diagnose them or anything like that. My role is simply one of listening to whatever it is they're talking about, in this case, grief, and just help guide them into places that are going to, in things, the techniques, things like that are going to help them.
Okay. So
it's really
sense.
Primarily really listening. And that's, again, when you're going through grief, that's what you probably need the most, is someone to listen to you.
Well, and especially probably somebody that's not necessarily as close to the event.
Yes.
Because sometimes you can share things that with, I don't know, stranger's not the right word, somebody that's not connected to it, and expressing feelings, expressing stuff that other people might think are inappropriate,
right,
or whatever that is. Now, I do want to know, too, what areas of grief do you work with? You were talking about expertise, and I know there's different areas, I think, of grief. We've talked a little bit about the hurricane that came through North Carolina and eastern Tennessee and all that, and there's a grief with that kind of loss, or mudslides in California, or loss of a loved one, different types of things, loss of a job, all sorts of different things. So what areas do you typically work with people?
Typically, it's death. It's the loss of a spouse or the loss of a loved one. It could be even the loss of a pet. I'm an animal lover, so I can identify with how painful that actually is. And that's primarily what it is. Some divorce, although I don't deal a whole lot with that. I do deal with people who have lost their jobs or lost their businesses. And this, as I said earlier, particularly during COVID, this was really prevalent. It's still actually happening quite a bit. Even things like the loss of a dream. You know, we all have dreams in our lives, the things that we think are going to happen to us. And when a time comes that we realize that's never going to happen, there's grief associated with that. So that kind of thing. I know you mentioned the hurricanes and, you know, the devastation that came from that. That is its own type of grief. And ordinarily, I don't deal with that all the time, although it's still grief. But that kind of grief is different in the sense that if you lose your home or you lose all your possessions or something like that, wow, that's devastating. And you feel terrible about that. Those are all replaceable things. You can recover, you can rebuild, you can replace, and that the grief that goes with that will eventually diminish and basically go away. Whereas the loss of a human life or the loss of a relationship that you really care a lot about, that's irreplaceable. And so what you have to do at that point is learn how to deal with your own grief. You have to learn how to live with that. You have to learn to accept it and figure out a way to get through the rest of your life.
Yeah. It leads me to another question, too, along the lines. So when I was going through school and doing my psychology courses and all that kind of stuff, kind of electives and things, we were talking about 5 stages of grief or 7 stages of grief? I forget how many stages there are.
It depends on who you talk to.
In talking with people, it seems like now it's not really a progression from one to the other, but it's all over the place. And what are some of the thoughts about that? And maybe with some of even the current thinking about how people react with grief?
Well, as you said, that there's the common one is 5 stages of grief. And those were established by Kubler-Ross. And she actually established those for a very different reason than what they came to actually be known as. But the truth is, and certainly this was the case for me and most everyone that I speak with, the stages can be anything. There's not 5, there's not 4, there's not 7. It just depends on your own situation. And they don't come in any particular order. I remember reading about that in my case and thinking, well, is there something wrong with me? Am I not doing this right? Because I'm not going through these stages like that. And of course, then when I started reading and then studying about that, I realized that, well, it's not a real thing. It's just, you might have, you know, some people have anger, they have all sorts of things, but they don't have, you know, what the next person has. So it just depends on you. And so I don't buy into the 5 stages or, as I said, 4, 7, or whatever it might be.
Right.
You know,
well, and the reason I was chuckling a little bit is because that was kind of I think a little bit of a callback to where we were talking about these expectations that I think as people were coming through school and as these were presented, and they're probably, to your point, presented for a different reason. Like, hey, here's some things that people will experience or tend to experience during grief. And then somehow it got codified into, well, here's what everybody's working through. And that wasn't the case. But then I think we've all got these expectations of, well, I'm going to be angry for a while and I'm going to deny things for a while and then I'm going to do this. And I think we can kind of internalize that and put those pressures on us. Like, when am I going to get past this piece to get to the next thing?
Exactly. Exactly. And, as I mentioned earlier about my mom thinking that after 2 weeks that I should be over it. I was acting, her words, ridiculous. And I'm sure that came from her own expectations of what grief is, what it looked like. And she had actually never experienced anything like I had. And so she just, she just had an idea in her mind, and it, what it did was it set up a wedge between us. It made me angry, of course. And I felt like, you don't understand me. You don't, you're not getting what this is all about. I just lost my husband. That's 2 weeks, for heaven's sake. And so, when people get into those kind of things, I think it's not a good thing. It's not a good idea because, again, everybody handles things differently. I know I had a friend who, she actually lost her husband 3 weeks after I lost mine. And she felt like, she didn't feel any of the longing that I did for having my husband back. Now, that did come later, but she didn't feel that in the early stages. So everybody's different. Every relationship's different. And, if you don't have a great relationship with the person you lost, you may not feel the grief as deeply as, say, I did, or the next person, because the depth of your love and your attachment to the person is not the same. So it just really depends a lot on the relationship as well.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the ways that men and women typically might show or experience grief? And I know we're not trying to say this is how you should feel, but
no,
by and large, and let's just say 50 and above, so we take the younger generation out of it. But how do older men and older women typically show or go through some of these things?
Well, men, as I said a little bit earlier, they tend to bottle things up. They have the attitude that they need to be strong. And there's a certain amount of weakness in their mind about showing their emotions. And sometimes they dive into very deep depressions as well. So then part of the reason for that is that they bottle up their emotions. They don't talk to anybody. They don't want anybody to know how badly they feel. And whereas women, society tends to allow them more freedom to express their emotions. They can cry openly and things like that, where men often don't feel like they can do that. So I think that's one of the things. Women, just because of our roles in society, we handle things differently. But I think older women still have the same problem that men do, in the sense that they don't like to share their emotions. They feel that they need to be strong, and they don't want maybe their families to know how badly they feel or how lonely they feel or whatever it may be. But all of those things are very destructive. You need to get support. You need to find someone that you can trust, whether it's a family friend, whether it's a family member, or someone like me, a counselor, who can help you by just allowing you to express your emotions and get those out.
Oh, that's great. Question I've got for you along those lines too is, as let's say family members and friends, if we have somebody that's experienced a loss, what are some of the things that we can do, especially when I might be talking to male friends of mine, and of course for us everything's fine, and so we're hearing that from a friend, like they may have lost a spouse, they may have some kind of loss. But when we're talking with them, hey, Bill, how are you doing? I'm fine. I'm good.
Yeah.
Whatever. Okay. How do we identify, and maybe how do we, reach out and really support a person that's saying that they're fine?
I think probably one of the big things is just checking in with them on a regular basis, including them in social activities if they'll participate. That's important. And it doesn't have to be anything big. Maybe if In your case, it might be that you like to go fishing, and maybe your friend likes to do the same. So invite them to do that, or go to a movie, or go have dinner or lunch or coffee. I know a lot of men like to gather in the early part of the day in coffee shops and sit and talk with one another. And maybe you're going to pair off if there's a group, especially you might pair off with someone that you feel like you can maybe express something. It's really just being there. And that's a hard position, because you don't know, especially if they're not sharing with you. They're saying, yeah, I'm fine. And you know darn well they're not. You might ask them questions about the person they lost, and see if you can evoke some sort of conversation that way. So it's just making sure that you're checking in on them and letting them know. And you can just tell them, if you need to talk, Greg, I'll be happy to talk with you, and I'll listen, and that kind of thing.
No, that's great advice. Tell me a little bit about some of the a typical client. How do they find you? How do they get involved? Because I also know too is you've got a community that I think you're starting to establish. So how does that process work when they maybe find you on the web or something?
Yes. Well, they can contact me through the website. I have my phone number, and all my contact information is there. I also have a free book that I give away. It's called Finding Peace in the Midst of Grief. And it's just a little guidebook is all it really is. And I give that away for anybody that wants it. And it's especially pertinent to those who have recently lost someone, but it's for anybody, really, and for any reason. And it just goes through some basic personal care things, really. And that in the early stages of grief, that's so important. And what I mean by that is, like I said, getting out of bed in the morning, taking a shower, eating, going out and for a walk, or getting out in nature in some way, depending on where you live. Staying in touch with people, answer your phone. If someone calls you or sends you a text, respond to that text, even though you don't feel like it. So it covers things like that. And so I have that available as well. I also have some of my clients come from word of mouth. And as I go on, I get more and more of those things. As far as the community that you mentioned, this is something new that I'm getting ready to start. And once again, it's because I think people need to have someone to talk with. I like groups because there's a certain energy, a certain positive energy that develops within those groups. And I think it's important. It's not only important for the person, whoever is suffering, but it makes the group itself, it just kind of, there's a dynamic that develops it's comforting for people, because the whole idea of all of that is to help you, is to support you. No matter what it is you need support through those times. I keep the groups small. I don't usually have more than 5 or 6 people in those groups. And the groups are about 6 weeks long. I feel like that's long enough. If they need more after that, certainly they can join another group, or we can work one-on-one. Just depends on what they need.
Okay. And are you taking clients on from North America or U.S., or how are you working?
Yes, I've only had clients from the U.S., but I certainly would entertain the idea of countries like Canada, for example. They possibly Mexico, places like that, where if they're English speaking, it doesn't, people from the UK, it could be, I'm not opposed to that at all. Grief is universal. It doesn't make any difference where you live, what part of the world you're in. As long as they're English speaking, then, we can work together.
Oh, sure. And what's the name of the website?
Second Act Mastery.
Okay, Second Act Mastery. And we'll be putting links to that into the show notes. So
thank you.
As people are mowing lawns or whatever, as they're listening to this, they can go to the show notes and find that link really easy.
Yeah, and my phone number and my email address is also there. So if they want to contact me directly, some people are reluctant to do that, so they send me an email or a text. That's fine. But either way, and the other thing that I do when someone initially contacts me, or they want to talk with me, I'll give them a complimentary conversation. Meaning that we I just want to kind of get to know you a little bit and see what your goals are and what you're suffering with and what your expectations are.
Okay. No, and that makes sense because you need to figure out if you're a good fit for each other,
That's right.
personality wise, approach wise, whatever that might be. Now, is there anything about your practice or anything about grief that you would like to talk about that maybe I haven't asked you yet?
Um, no, I think, I mean, there's a lot to it, but like I said, I emphasize the fact that first and foremost, people need to know they're not alone. They're not isolated. They don't need to be. That having someone to speak with that they can trust, that is not going to pass judgment, that isn't going to give them a lot of advice. That's really the crux of the whole thing. It's so important that they do this. They need to know that they have a friend, and that even after the session stop, they can always contact me again, and we can continue the conversation if they feel like they need it.
Oh, sure. That's great. I think too, when we were talking just before we started recording, there was a quote that you wanted to share with the audience.
Yes, and I'll go ahead and read this. It says, "I am both the person who I used to be, a person with a set of memories from before, and a new person, one who sees and experiences most things fundamentally differently. I am both the same and radically altered. The world is both as it always was, and forever changed." That quote comes from a group called What's Your Grief? And I think that is so right on. One of the things that I noticed after my husband died was life, it's not the same. It doesn't feel the same. It never will be the same. You don't go through grief and just get over it. All you can do is accept it. You move forward and you try to rebuild your life or find a new life. I know there's a saying out there that says, "Oh, this is the new normal." I don't particularly like it.
No.
There's nothing normal about losing someone you love, but you can rebuild your life, and you can. It's a lot of work. It takes time, but it's worth doing. And I'm living proof of that it's possible to heal and rebuild and live a joyful, purposeful life, even after something as devastating as losing someone you love so much. It just, you really can do that. And I can honestly tell you that I've learned how to embrace life again. I'm whole again, and I'm truly fulfilled by helping others move forward themselves.
Oh, that's awesome. And I think too what you were talking about is finding that new community, that new sometimes you lose a network of friends with a loss and
Yes.
finding your new network, and sometimes that's relocating physically and sometimes it's just getting into different interests or whatever. But the importance of being around people and being connected with people is super helpful during these periods.
I think so too. And I know in my case, I did move. I mentioned early on before we started this that I'm a native Californian, and I moved here to Utah because my daughter and her family are here and they wanted me to be here. And I knew deep down that I needed to be near them. And so I did make that change. And, it's, again, nothing is ever the same, but it can be just as good. And I know one of the things I asked myself somewhere in the midst of all of this was if my husband, if in my case, if Bobby, my husband, could say something to me, what would he say? And I knew that he would say to me, "I want you to move on with your life. I want you, or move forward with your life. I want you to be happy. I want you to live your life to the fullest and do what you want to do. And I'll always be there with you." And he is. And so that, I think that's really important to think about those things, because there is life after someone has passed away. And like I said, I'm living proof of that. And I know that if you really want that, you can achieve that.
That's great. A wonderful note to end our conversation on. Kerri, thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I really have enjoyed this conversation and have gotten a lot out of it.
As have I, Greg. And I thank you so much for, like I said, allowing me to share with your listeners on the topic of grief.